Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Mackinac Center's Summer Policy Forum, How to Get Michigan Growing Again. My name is David Gunther, and I am the Mackinac Center's Vice President of Government Affairs. The Mackinac Center for Public Policy is a nonprofit research and educational institute that advances the principles of free markets and limited government. Through our research and education programs, we challenge government overreach and advocate for free market approaches to public policy that free people to realize their potential and their dreams. Since 1987, we have been a champion for freedom for the residents of Michigan and beyond, from hot dog stands to food trucks, to parents seeking educational choice, to workers exercising union rights, to overtaxed business owners and entrepreneurs fighting for a level playing field. With them and others, we work to advance a freer and more prosperous Michigan. During months when the Michigan legislature is in session, we host a policy event series in Lansing called Issues and Ideas. But when they go on their summer recess, we host the Policy Forum event series in communities across Michigan. We're glad to be back here in Traverse City again. And now for today's program. While states in America's South and West are booming, Michigan's population today is smaller than it was 20 years ago. Blue ribbon councils and Lansing politicians talk about the need to get Michigan growing again, but key indicators show our state continues to spin its wheels and dig even deeper into the muck. Some believe Michigan is doomed due to its winter climate, but other cold weather states have found strategies to prosper. Today, we're pleased to bring you a discussion from three experts on lessons Michigan can apply from states that are succeeding in attracting job seekers, families, and businesses. First, we have Michael Lefebvre, the Senior Director of the Maury Fiscal Policy Initiative for the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, where he has worked since 1995. He is best known for his scholarly work examining state economic development programs. I'm not going to use air quotes as a courtesy. His studies and frequent commentaries on the subject have garnered him a national reputation as a respected critic of state and local government economic development policies. Next, Meg Tazinski is the Assistant Director and Research Assistant Professor of the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. Her research focuses primarily on the determinants and correlates of economic freedom. A second but related strand of research focuses on the potential of private philanthropic organizations to provide viable alternatives to public poverty relief programs. Before joining the Bridwell Institute, Meg was the program manager for Spending and Budget Initiative at the Mercatus Center. She earned her PhD and Master's in Economics and dual BA in Philosophy and Economics from George Mason University. Her research interests include Austrian economics, public choice, new institutional economics, and political economy. Finally, Michael Van Beek is the Director of Research for the Mackinac Center. He has authored several studies for the center, as well as analysis and commentaries that have been published in the Wall Street Journal, Detroit News, Detroit Free Press, Grand Rapids Press, the Oakland Press, and elsewhere. I will moderate the discussion between our presenters for the first 45 minutes or so of the program, and leave some time at the end for your questions. At each of your places, there is a pen and a note card. Please write a question if you have something that comes to your mind during the presentation. Hold it up and one of our staff will come by and pick it up from you. They will give it to me. I will try to get through as many of the questions as I can during our time. If we run out of time before we can get to your question, we will be around afterwards to address them with you individually. I would respectfully request that you keep any questions on topic. So. First question, and I'm going to address this to Mike Lefebvre first. Michigan's population has been stuck for a generation, has significantly lagged the nation since the 1970s. Why do you believe that is?
Well, I think there's a clear association between state public policy and interstate migration, which is a major driver in population changes. Scholars for decades, academics, have tried to tease out what they call determinants of interstate migration for many, many years. It's a wide field of research. And in general, lay changes in population in states at the foot of really economic freedom. They'll chop up that idea into smaller parts, but ultimately they argue that more flexible marketplaces lead to more opportunity for people to work, lower unemployment rates, which act as something of a signal to induce people to move to a particular area. There's one public policy that I see come up in the literature very often, and it has to do with labor market flexibility, and that's right-to-work laws. Richard Vedder's an economist, retired from Ohio University, and he has said that the great untold story of American migration in the 20th century is the movement of Americans away from non-right-to-work states to right-to-work states. And that's continued in the 21st century. From 2010 to 2020, we have seen 4.5 million of our fellow Americans on net balance get up and move from non-right-to-work states to right-to-work states. Now, they don't wake up in the morning and think, Texas is right to work, I am moving. But it's a variable in the equation to move that's very important, because that extra labor market flexibility contributes to greater economic opportunity, which draws people in. And since I've mentioned Texas, I should probably offer Megan an opportunity to chime in here.
You had 2 words for me. You had economic freedom and Texas. So those are my calling cards here. So my institute at Southern Methodist University, we help create an index of economic freedom, which rates and ranks states in terms of things like tax policy, government spending policy, and labor market regulations. And this index came about in the early 2000s. So we have a lot of research now showing the relationship between economic freedom and prosperity, showing the relationship between relatively low taxes, Texas has no state income tax, and measures of prosperity, between freer labor markets and these measures of prosperity, and between sort of reasonable levels of government spending. Michigan, in our index, has lagged the nation in almost, we have data going back to 1981. Almost every year, Michigan's had higher government spending than the national average. And in every single year we have data for, Michigan has more burdensome labor market regulations than the national average. And so if there's this big relationship between economic freedom and prosperity, and Michigan is scoring poorly in terms of economic freedom, then that seems to be a big part of the puzzle as to why people aren't moving here. People want to move to places or stay in places where they have opportunities to become prosperous. And Michigan just doesn't seem to be providing those opportunities.
What consequences has that had on our state?
Oh, well, I would suggest there could be profound ones. If you just looked at personal income and taxable income as one item in the larger picture, between 2020 and 2021, 7,300 of our fellow citizens on net balance moved to Florida. And they took their income and their talent with them. And from the public perspective, they took their taxable income with them. So you're not only losing the money that they might spend in their local economy for business services and that sort of thing, and personal services, but you're losing money that's taxed by the government and hopefully spent on true public goods to make them more efficient and useful, which by in itself, if it's the right public good, can be an inducement to move to Michigan. So we're losing people, and that's just Florida on net balance. There's other states that our citizens have moved to and taken taxable income with them as well.
Around this time last year, Governor Whitmer announced the creation of the Growing Michigan Together Council to advise her on specific policies to grow Michigan's population, including identifying a population goal for 2050. I'm not sure if it made the news up here, but earlier this week, Governor Whitmer disbanded the council. Why didn't that report get traction?
Well, I read the report from cover to cover.
I'm sorry.
It was painful. I don't recommend it. I think Mike did too, probably. We share pain. I think part of the reason that council didn't get much traction is because the report that they produced didn't have very much in way of meaningful information to help policymakers come up with different ways to make the population grow. It was groupthink at its worst. The council was composed of politicians and lobbyists and special interest groups and bureaucrats. So what we got out of that was a report that had lots of vague policy goals and platitudes, but no real specific information or details or plans about how to make the population grow. I think that that's a big part of it. There wasn't really anything to make of that report, and now the council is disbanded, And so all we have is the report, and it doesn't have anything of value. So that's okay with us because the Mackinac Center is here to fill in the void. We know what can make populations grow, and we've got lots of very specific policies that the state should consider to help make the population grow.
I would add briefly that when it was released, there just didn't seem to be any administration support from the governor's office for this report. There were a couple of hearings held in Lansing, and the state's chief growth officer just came in and testified basically on the same things that were in the report, but there wasn't a lot of evidence presented to suggest that the ideas that they were laying out would actually have a positive impact. And I found it quite striking that the person who was in charge of the Population Council told a reporter that they didn't expect the ideas, if adopted from the report, to yield results for 25 years. But it was my understanding that as part of the charge this council had, they were supposed to come up with a solution where the solution would be in place within 25 years. Our population would stop declining and actually be much larger than it is today. So even though the lead on the report said he hadn't heard from the governor's office after it was released, and he feared that the report was just going to be another blue ribbon commission that collected dust on a shelf somewhere.
What does the research really show about what makes people decide where they want to live, work, and raise a family?
So again, I go back to economic freedom, and I'm going to give you 2 data points here. California and Texas. California, perennial bottom dweller in terms of economic freedom. Texas, perennially in the top 5 in terms of economic freedom. You know, I think there's a suggestion that U.S. News and World Report comes out with this, like, where do people want to live report every year, and natural attractiveness is one of the things that they rank. Natural attractiveness of California, it's a wonderful place, it's beautiful, and people have been flooding out of the states for years because poor policy trumps natural attractiveness when it comes to people deciding where to live and where to work and where to raise their families. Texas is miserable during the summer. I'm delighted to be here right now. But good policy trumps natural attractiveness in determining where to live and where to work. And so we have decades of research on economic freedom if you take our cross-state index and our cross-country index. And the strongest relationship we found in all of that literature is the relationship between economic freedom and economic growth. And and study after study, maybe not hundreds, I think somewhere around 80 studies have found this relationship. And where do people want to live? They want to live in places that are growing, in places where they have the propensity to be prosperous.
If I can just chime in before hearing from the other two, since you mentioned California and Texas, takes me back to my previous life. Before moving to Michigan in 2018 and joining the Mackinac Center, I worked for the Texas Public Policy Foundation in Austin, which is the Mackinac Center's counterparts down there. Around 2009, 2010, we were working with Dr. Arthur Laffer on a series of papers that was called Competitive States that looked at Texas versus California. And one of the most compelling data points, which we were able to independently verify, was you may have seen something about a U-Haul index, where you look at where people are renting and moving between U-Haul trucks. During that time, 15 years ago, if you rented a U-Haul truck from San Francisco and drove it to Austin, the rental rate was about $3,100. If you were wanting to rent a U-Haul in Austin and drive it to San Francisco, U-Haul would literally give you the truck because it meant they didn't have to fly one of their own people from San Francisco to Austin to drive it back.
One of the things that we did last year was commissioned a study on population growth, on state-level population growth. And we had an economist who's from Michigan originally. She teaches now at a small private school in North Carolina. She's actually a former Mackinac Center intern and employee, so it was really fun working with her. But she's an excellent economist, and she looked at the literature on state-level population change and what does the economic research say about what influences this. And she looked at over 100 papers. And what she found is, there's 4 main drivers of state-level population growth. There's birth rates, death rates, international migration, and domestic migration, state-to-state movement. And what the literature suggests is that policymakers can't they're very limited in the impact that they can have on things like birth rates and death rates. That's much larger, more complex dynamic phenomenon than what policymakers can just kind of put their thumb on and start having more babies or fewer people die. At the state level, they don't have much control over international migration either, because that's a federal issue. And so really the thing that state policymakers can have an influence on is this domestic interstate migration. And there, the literature is clear, as Meg knows, right? It's the states that are growing, the states that get more domestic migration are the ones that offer more economic freedom. They offer more prosperity, more opportunities, which leads to more prosperity, which is what can draw people into their states. So back to the council. One other theory I have about why the council maybe didn't get any traction, or why people just sort of put that report on the shelf and walked away from it, was maybe they learned that there's not a whole lot that policymakers can do to increase the population quickly. It takes a long time, these changes to happen. They don't happen on an election cycle. And so maybe there's not a lot of value for a politician to run on this kind of issue, because you can't really solve it by the next time you're running for office. So maybe there was very little political value in that report, or in this endeavor to try to grow the population.
In addition to the nearly 100 academic studies that we're familiar with at the Mackinac Center, that I'm sure Meg has seen in her own research, there are scholars who do research that doesn't end up in academic journals that is still of very high quality. In 2010, we asked Michael Hicks of Ball State University to do a determinants of interstate migration study that would specifically measure inbound and outbound traffic of Michigan to determine what made people get up and go or move here. And he looked at the most important variables that he thought were important to include based on literature, and he's found that the tax variable was the most important in his research. What he found was that for every 10% increase in the tax differential between Michigan and other states, and this is personal taxes, an additional 4,700 of our fellow citizens left the state every year after this gap increase. So that 11.5% personal income tax increase in 2007 that we experienced could have potentially chased away 80,000 of our fellow citizens since then. And this is again another situation where somebody doesn't wake up and think, oh, this tax differential is killing me, I'm going to leave. In some cases that might be true, but it all is part of a larger population equation. What's important here too is even if our taxes aren't going up, 27 states have cut personal and corporate and other taxes since 2020 or 2021. So our gulf between our state and others on the tax front is widening just by doing nothing.
Many argue that recent policy changes have made Michigan even more uncompetitive and unattractive. Which are the ones that will have the greatest impact on Michigan's ability to attract people and jobs?
Well, one through line for me is clearly the loss of our right to work state. The Mackinac Center wanted to be the first to try and put a number on the impact that right to work, the law, had on Michigan and its economy. And we pulled in data from 3,000 American counties. And we tried to measure changes in employment share along the border of states where one state had right to work protections and another state did not. And what we found was that in states that adopted right to work after 2000, like Michigan, there was an increase of 21% in the employment share in manufacturing in those border counties, a very large increase. And there are other results too. We didn't look at just manufacturing, but we also found that even if there wasn't a net increase in employment share, there was a realignment away from non-right to work states to right to work. So while we saw big increases and Indiana saw increases, it was almost offset completely by the losses we were able to measure in Ohio. So now, Michigan was beating Ohio in something other than football.
And I just kind of want to piggyback on that. So one of the areas that we look at is the labor market regulations in our index, and forced unionization certainly is part of that index. So I want to echo what Mike says here. Another thing that we measure is minimum wage, the relative minimum wage. And listen, minimum wage is great for people who can get that minimum wage, but the question, you have a relatively high minimum wage compared to other states. Great for people who can get that minimum wage, but the real question is that creating a flourishing labor market writ large, or is it only helping some subset of people who can get access to minimum wage jobs? And what the literature finds again and again is minimum wage doesn't create a flourishing environment. In fact, it hampers people's ability to get a foothold in the labor force. So that's disproportionately tough for younger people, and I think what we see in states like Illinois and Michigan, where people are leaving a lot, it's a lot of younger people who are seeking out opportunities elsewhere.
The other thing I would like to mention too is a significant barrier to businesses, companies who are considering moving to Michigan. Maybe they have 7 great reasons to move here, but when they look at our energy prices, they get repelled quickly. Michigan has the highest electricity prices in the region. They're only going to go higher because we're on this foolish mission to get to net zero, which is never going to happen, and we're just going to waste billions of dollars trying to do this mission. So we have to do something about electricity prices. Michigan used to be a competitive state. We used to have electricity choice, where we would create pressure on electricity generators to compete in a market so that we could drive down prices and put downward pressure on those prices that we pay. Now we don't have that. It's a very small amount of choice that's allowed. It's 10% of the market is allowed to be in the choice market, and that's been full and capped for a very long time. So we need much more sensible electricity and energy policies. The current administration is going in exactly the wrong direction, sending all the wrong signals along those lines. Michigan looks like it's just going to continue to become more and more expensive to operate a business here because of those really high electricity prices.
Over the last year and a half, the governor and legislature have allocated billions of dollars toward company-specific subsidies, with several billion more awaiting legislative action when they return from the summer recess. Will that do any good?
Oh, well, not only will it will be unlikely to do any good, it might actually do harm. There's a great study done by some North Carolina economists that looked at 2,400 economic development deals across 35 states. And when they looked at the data, what they did was they tracked employment at these companies, 2,400 of them that had been subsidized, or at least the deals, and then they compared the performance after the subsidy to like companies that did not get a subsidy. And what they reported was a, quote, starkly negative, end quote, employment impact from the companies that had been subsidized. The ones who had not been subsidized actually performed better. And that's just one study. The Mackinac Center has done their own study, and scholars across the country have produced hundreds, at least 300, 400 of them, on various types of economic development programs run at the state and local level, and they found them to be wanting.
My colleague Dean Stansel and I are one of those sets of people who produced one of those studies. And several years ago, we did a paper on economic development incentives and entrepreneurship, because it's clear that companies who get economic development incentives are helped by those incentives. But our question is, what does that do for the broader entrepreneurial environment? And so we measured entrepreneurship in a variety of different ways: patent activity, net new business formation, the opening of large businesses, the opening of small businesses. And what we found is that in states that received more economic development incentives of various types, tax breaks, subsidies, they tended to have much lower patent activity. The 10 businesses that have large businesses, 500 or more employees, tended to see a little bit of a boost, actually, but that came at the expense of small businesses. Businesses that had fewer than 10 employees were actually harmed by these sorts of subsidies. You had fewer of those businesses in those states. And so, again, I think that supports this narrative that the companies that get the subsidies are helped. They're generally very large companies, but it's probably not creating a whole environment where entrepreneurship can thrive, We also, because we're at an Economic Freedom Institute, put economic freedom in there, and across the board on almost every metric of entrepreneurship we had, economic freedom, creating an environment for prosperity was key to unleashing entrepreneurship.
One more item, Dave, real quick, because you mentioned what could be coming. Since 2023 alone, the legislature has authorized $4.4 billion worth of handouts. And on the horizon, there's another $3 billion that would be approved or authorized going forward another 10 years. That's an opportunity cost right there, because money authorized for corporate handouts might be better spent on true public goods or just cutting taxes for everyone.
Could fill a lot of potholes.
What's that?
$4 billion can fill a lot of potholes.
A lot of potholes. Roads and bridges are still a thing. In fact, the state's Asset Management Council says that we're still not putting our roads together as fast as they're falling apart.
I swear this question was in the script before last night's news, but for Mike Bambeek, how much was Michigan's population and reputation across the country affected by our state's COVID response?
It's difficult to say. I mean, I really hope that the COVID response that we got does not have a long-lasting negative impact on the reputation of the state. But it certainly had an impact. Governor Whitmer issued some of the most severe lockdowns in the whole country. A larger portion of businesses in Michigan were forced to close than in any other state. That includes California and New York and all the crazy stories you heard from all around. Like, we were as bad or worse than all of those. So shooting yourself in the foot doesn't help. And so we've been very slowly trying to recover from those economic shutdowns. Michigan has been making progress, but we're one of the slowest recovering states of the 50. So I hope it doesn't have a long-lasting reputation. I'm hopeful that enough people have learned that lockdowns don't work to stop easily transmissible coronaviruses. They just do not work. That's what that's what the research has said so far too. They're all pain and no gain, basically. So I hope we won't ever do those again, and maybe Michigan's reputation won't have a damaged or long-lasting damage to it.
Okay. If you have questions, I've got a few more questions on the script before we go to yours. So if you've got any thoughts that have been provoked by our speakers thus far, please write them on the card and hold them up, and we'll collect them and get ready to get into those. I think I'll toss this one to Meg first. Which are the states that Michigan is competing with for jobs and people, and what are they doing to be attractive that we're not?
So both the Census Bureau and the IRS track state-to-state migration. And no matter which data set that you look at, Florida is the #1 place that you're losing residents to. Texas is distant but notable #2. And so where do those fall on the Economic Freedom Index? #2 and #4. So having reasonable low taxes, reasonable labor market regulations, and reasonable levels of government spending, or sustainable levels of government spending, I think are really key there. If you look at, so there's a whole literature on the state-to-state migration that looks just at movement at borders. And so because people who want to move to leave sort of punishing tax or regulatory environments, but still want to be near their family, are going to move across the border somewhere. And so Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio are the next sort of 3 big states that people move to when they're leaving Michigan. I'm originally from Illinois. It's sort of a fiscal basket case, but you have Illinois has better labor market policies according to our index than Michigan has, which is really was stunning when I looked that up. And so it's depressing, right? And so, I think those are the states that you're losing residents to. So if you look at places like Texas and Florida, though, freer labor markets, better tax environment, more reasonable and sustainable. And what I mean by sustainable levels of government spending is you've got revenue that is sort of commensurate to make up the government spending. One thing that Michigan has been doing in recent years, by my understanding, has been dipping into savings in order to sort of sustain the spending. I think it was one of your colleagues, Hochman? Holman was a paper that I read sort of discussing this. And so, you need, having those tax and spending conversations in tandem is really important as well.
Yeah, I would say that, again, this comes back to labor policy and the right to work variable. 9 out of the top 10 performing freedom states in the Freedom Index that Meg works on are right to work states. If you look at just the reports that came out last December on where Americans moved in 2023, 8 of the top 10 are right-to-work states, and the 9th, Colorado, has what's called the Labor Peace Act, which is a modified right-to-work state as well. So again, evidence pops up every time I open something to look at it that shows right-to-work is probably a very powerful variable in the equation to move or not.
When one brings up Michigan's stagnant population and unwise policies, a common retort that I hear, especially in Lansing, is, well, people just don't like cold weather. It can't be that simple, can it?
No. It's, what's that?
Yes.
They don't like hot and humid weather either.
Well, no, it's not that simple. Again, there's many variables in the equation to move or not. I would first say that in the first half of the 20th century, we had to beat people back at our borders. The whole country wanted to move here because we were an opportunity state, just like Texas and Florida are opportunity states today. Also, there's this great study by Jordan Rappaport who looked at just weather as a determinant of interstate migration. And he said that Michigan's weather contributes 0% to negative 1.5% to our inbound migration patterns. So that tells me that we have to have state public policy that is so good that it swamps states where we're competing on weather, on a more temperate climate, the Carolinas, Tennessee, these states that end up in the top 10 inbound state, for measures of moves, but who also have other good policies.
And I think, and looking at this question, I went and looked at just a map of the U.S., our economic freedom map, and all along the Canadian border are a lot of other cold states, and they vary substantially in terms of economic freedom and in terms of prosperity. So North Dakota is the second highest personal income per capita, and it ranks in the top, it's number 10 in terms of economic freedom. So I go back to sort of the line that I said before, good policy can trump sort of a bad natural, I don't want to say bad natural environment, but a sort of undesirable natural environment. People, and like you said, people don't like hot weather either, but my colleague Dean Stantz and I did another study when you mentioned the U-Haul data here. During COVID, you had this divorce between where people worked and where they lived. There was sort of this big rise of virtual opportunities. And so that was kind of a cool natural experiment for those of us who love data. When people don't have to live where they work, where do they choose to live? And they were flooding out of states that were not economically free. We saw so many moves out of places like California, Illinois, and New York, and coming into places like Florida and Texas. Texas, as you said, it's hot. It's terrible for at least 4 months out of the year, but people were coming there because we have the good policies, not because we have the good weather.
Which cold weather states are growing and why?
Well, there's a consistent 3 states that appear in the top 10 in terms of growth measures, and that's Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. Yeah, I've watched that over some time. Idaho is tops in terms of economic growth, 5th fastest growth rate in the nation from the pandemic era forward, 2020 through 2023. Their economy grew at something over 14%. Compare that to Michigan, which grew at 9% and was ranked 28th in growth since the pandemic. If you look at this as a measure of job creation, then Utah and Idaho are number 1 and number 2 at 13% and 12% respectively. Michigan finished 36th in that growth rate from 2020 to 2024, and their growth rate in terms of percentage was 1.2%. So quite a big difference. Michigan recovered much more slowly than other states, and maybe from the pandemic, and maybe that was a function of our harsher lockdown.
And I also go back to this income per capita. So again, going just along the Canadian border where we have other cold states. North Dakota, second highest income per capita amongst those cold weather states along the border. We've got Washington is number 12. Massachusetts, or no, that's New Hampshire, is number 11 in terms of income per capita. So these are cold states, but they're wealthy states because people want to live there because they're much freer. And those are states that rank relatively decently in terms of economic freedom as well. New Hampshire is our sort of perennial number 1 ranked state in terms of economic freedom for reasons that I won't get into here. But I'm reminded of this natural resource curse that we find in the literature. People tend to say that places that are blessed with abundant sort of natural resources, those should be the places that are prosperous, right? And in fact, what the literature has found that those natural resources can very often end up being a curse instead. You know, you think about oil-rich countries. They tend to not have very good policies because they just have this sort of one industry. You know, I think about weather in the same way. The natural resources or the lack of good weather, instead of being a curse, may actually be an opportunity to overcome if you have the right sorts of policies in place.
Lastly, before I get to our audience questions, if you could pick one policy to change to get people and jobs flowing back into Michigan, which would that be? And I'll start at the end with Mike.
I think it would send a very strong signal if Michigan cut the income tax in a significant way, and then maybe create a plan to eventually eliminate it. Almost all the states that don't have a state income tax are in the South or the West, and Michigan would stand out in the Rust Belt as being a state open for business if we were actively trying to cut the income tax. And I don't mean how the legislature tried to do it several years ago with a cute formula and this very complicated math equation over how to do it when we have certain amounts of revenue and all this kind of stuff. And it didn't work because the governor now has just said, well, we're not even going to allow that tax cut to remain permanent. So, I mean, a real cut. Cut it a significant amount and send a strong signal to employers, to entrepreneurs, that Michigan is open for business. And I think I know what Mike Lefebvre is going to say, so I'll let him go next, which is send the same kind of signal, right?
Yeah, of course, there's my through line of being getting our right to work status back. I've only mentioned the study that we did, but there's many studies done by academics and others that just show what a powerful economic development tool that this is. As we were preparing to release our study, 2 Harvard economists released their own study on right to work, and they used a similar methodology, but they looked deeper, and they found that having a right to work state increases the population. It increases inbound commuter traffic, suggesting that people drive into your state to work for the day and then drive home to their state if they're not a right to work state. It also has a connection with lower childhood poverty rates and greater labor force participation. So that would be a big one. Of course, a close second I would have to say is our energy policy. A couple of our colleagues actually put a figure on it, something like the renewables mandates will cost each person $2,700 a piece going forward. So
annually.
Annually. So that's an increase, that's an extra burden that we'll have to carry on our shoulders that isn't a tax one, but is very taxing itself.
And the one thing I will say when it comes to cutting taxes, it's important when having discussions about cutting taxes to have those discussions about tax cuts and government spending in tandem, because ultimately the taxation is supposed to be supporting the spending. And so if you're wanting to cut taxes, getting spending in control is also important to do at the same time. You know, most states, almost every state except one, has a balanced budget requirement. And so, you know, those are real, but there are lots of cute ways you can get around these balanced budget requirements. So having a real conversation about if we're going to cut taxes, what kind of sort of wasteful spending can we also cut at the same time? And I think there are lots and lots of places, you know better than I do, about your own state of where you could start with that.
All right, we will transition to your questions now. We've got some great ones in the stack. I think I will take first shot at this first one. Electricity and energy. What about the electric vehicles being shoved down our throats? Where do you see it going? I will begin by mentioning a couple of recent polls that I've seen. This is something that is on the minds of a lot of policymakers, maybe not the ones who run the show in Lansing, but also a lot of people around the policy space. These surveys have asked Michigan residents, how many of you see yourself potentially buying an electric vehicle? What would you rate your likelihood over the next 5 years? And the survey data I've seen is 80% say no chance. That you see maybe 5% of the people in Michigan who are likely to purchase an electric vehicle by their own choice within the next 5 years. You are seeing people who have purchased electric vehicles, about a third of them are now trying to unload them and go back to internal combustion engines.